So good to have you here in person, online, however that is. We'll start with the prayer in the student question book on page 33. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, King of time and eternity, we thank you for teaching us to understand that we are on a journey to our eternal homeland. Thank you for enabling us to make that journey with joy and confidence, knowing that you walk beside us to show us the way. We thank you for empowering us to make it with a sense of peace, knowing that although we stray and stumble, you are there with a forgiving smile to pick us up and restore us to the path that you would have us walk. We praise you for the meaning you give to our lives. We thank and glorify you for assuring us that when our walk through this world comes to an end, we shall have the honor and joy of seeing you and living in your presence to praise you to all eternity. We pray in the precious name of your beloved Son, who lived and died to make all things possible, now and forever. Amen. As we get ready to review the lesson from last time, I don't know if it's inspired or exactly what, but I want to remind you that on this journey, we will be exploring passages and maybe even entire books that you've never been in before, and make no promises that everything will become crystal clear after we've done this journey. In fact, what you'll probably discover is what I discover each time when I take this course, is that I dig a little deeper and understand a little more, but also know there's a lot more to understand. And that's okay. And I also try to remind people when we read through some of these more troubling or unnerving texts and narratives, that we want to hang on fast to the New Testament promises. We're reading, spending a lot of time in the Old Testament so that we can better understand the New. But don't let the nastiness, if you will, of some of these narratives dissuade you or frighten you too terribly. So there's just a lot there. And anyway, so as we look at the law codes, we'll review the lesson we had the last time. So if you turn in your textbook to page 126, we'll look at several illustrations as well as the descriptions of certain sections that don't have illustrations with them. So if someone wants to read 9a.
After the Exodus, when God gathered the Israelites around his awesome presence at Mount Sinai, he first told them who he was and what he had done for them. And only then did he spell out how he wanted them to live. Obedience to the commandments was never to be seen as a way to establish a relationship with God. Rather, obedience to the commandments was to be seen as a way to reflect on the relationship God had already established with his people. The law codes were to serve as guidelines for reflecting God's will, living in community, witnessing and experiencing joy.
And so that sentence toward the end with establish and reflect are important to keep in mind, that the law codes are designed to reflect. Our obedience even is designed to reflect the God who has claimed us. And we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that those things are what save us or what establish or build our relationship with God. So, excuse me, this picture has then the a stylized idea of Mount Sinai with the cloud and the lightning on the top, as we saw when we looked at Exodus 19. God's presence is often described that way in the Bible, Old and New. And you see the yellow symbol, the law code here. My mouse shows it a little bit. This is the covenant itself. And then would be 6 dots, but in the place of the 3rd dot is the commandments. And so we have the preamble, the historical prologue, the stipulations, the preservation and rereading, the witnesses, the blessings and curses, and then finally the tabernacle down here at the bottom, because when God descended on the mountain to meet with Moses and establish this covenant, God then descended onto the tabernacle. We'll pick up with that in some of our readings today. And the people you see gathered around. And here in this illustration, you see their kind of alternating male and female figures joining hands, and you see their heads and their arms and their torsos. But sometimes the pictures are small, and so all you see are the circle of dots. So just remember, just like you see a circle of dots serving as the heads around this, that sometimes the circle of dots will symbolize community. So any questions on that review point? All right, let's take the next one. Somebody 9B.
God's people are to see all life as a sacred affair. They live on a planet that God made and owns. Each dwells within the body God made and owns. In whatever they do, they are to see themselves as going to God, to God for others, and to others for God. There is no such thing as a secular realm.
Thank you. And you've heard the phrase priesthood of all believers. This is a picture that kind of symbolizes that, whatever your role is in life. So however you might fill in the word underneath that little green pulpit, we're called to go to God on behalf of our neighbors, go to our neighbors on behalf of God. This is what it means to be, and it's living out that covenant. And so here you see, again, that covenant symbol with the would be 6 dots, but dot number 3 is the law codes, and then superimposed on the law codes, you see 2 people in the form of a servant, because that is what we're called to do. One last illustration. 9C.
Throughout the Bible, biblical narrative, God first tells his people who he is and what he has done for them. And only then does he tell them how they are to live under his lordship. The sequence is always indicative. Because I, God, have done this for you, imperative, therefore, this is how you are to think, speak, and act as my people.
And so that because, therefore, here in the upper level, left-hand side, you see the symbol for the Exodus. That's the great rescue event of the Old Testament. On the right-hand side, the symbol of the stylized version of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. Here's the great rescue event, not only of the New Testament, but Christians would argue the great rescue event of the Bible and of all time in history. These are meant to, because God has done these things, therefore we are called to live in loving service and obedience. It is not flipping it upside down like we want to and say, hey, God, because we do this, therefore you are called to do that. No, that is a misinterpretation of what this is about. It's rather what we see here. Because God, therefore us. Questions on that one? All right, and then I'll take the liberty to read here. 9D simply mentioned that throughout Exodus to Deuteronomy, there are 6 collections of law codes with the 10 commandments. That's what we're most familiar with. But we looked at the covenant code, the ritual decalogue, looked a little bit at, talked about the Deuteronomic code, the priestly code, the holiness code, and we'll actually get to the book of Deuteronomy as a whole chapter a little bit. There's different kinds of laws that are found. There's commands, there's statutes with an exhortation, there's ordinances that relate to rituals. And because the Israelites were to understand themselves as God's unique, holy, chosen people, they were to act, therefore, in a unique, holy way in all that they did. They were to practice a certain exclusiveness in their dealings with other nations, especially in areas like marriages or agreements or covenants. And they were to be different in terms of what they wore, what they ate. You see some of that. And then life in relation to God is not merely something of Sabbath worship and ritual. It's something that applied to the totality of life. And so there's all these things that speak about life within the family circle, within business dealings, dealing with the disadvantaged, the poor, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, right? The handicapped, the animal world, the realm of nature. It's kind of all over the place. And although some scholars and students believe that God gave all the law codes in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to Moses at Mount Sinai, others believe that some of the law codes contained in these writings were developed over a period of time and adapted to deal with new situations. So, as I said, I think in the very first session we had, surprise, surprise, Bible scholars debate these sorts of things. And we are really, it's in a lot of these areas, it's fair to say something like this: work it out in the way that it makes the most sense to you. We may find ourselves not always in the same place, and that's all right, particularly on some of these matters that one might argue aren't necessarily core. So, any questions on the previous unit? Otherwise, we're going to jump to Unit 10, which is the wilderness wanderings, and then this brings us to the conclusion of the first of the 6 books that we have. So we started way back in creation. We'll get, by the time we end up today, we'll be sort of right ready to go into the promised land. But then, as you'll see, rather than jumping right in to the promised land, we camp out for a while in the book of Deuteronomy. So that'll be our lesson that follows this one. So just by way of review, we have been in Genesis for a while, and now Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, a little bit of looking at Leviticus with some of the law codes, but there's not narrative per se in there. So we're kind of picking the narrative back up, and we're returning then here. And I wanted to just go over the timeline with you a little bit. So if you want to grab your timelines and take a look, again, the black balls with the numbers in them for the centuries, obviously going down because we're in quote unquote BC time period. To the left of the 1900 is a question mark, simply because there's debate about how exactly to place those events in time. And but when we get to Abraham, it's somewhere around here, and the timeline that unfolds, which is this central line, then starts off pink, then purple, then blue, then green, then the black and yellow, etc. This, most people, there's not nearly as much debate or discussion about all of that, but so the timeline ties in with the narrative. The pictures to the left to begin with and underneath pick up some of those themes. So you can see the numbers at the very bottom of the timeline, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. that show here. Those are frames, and underneath those frames are explanatory notes in your timeline itself. So that should help to explain some of these. But again, we look at the timeline, and then we continue on going through the time in Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt. And now we're basically doing this little loop-de-loop here, this wilderness wandering before we enter into the promised land. Okay. So I will let that go for now. And so you can sort of see a loop-de-loop arrow here, not quite as stylized as it is there, but here we have an arrow coming out of that land of Goshen and then heading down to Mount Sinai, and then up and around and then back, and then eventually up and out you go around. And so that's, again, a simplified picture. We are looking at the area used by the Mediterranean Sea as, once again, a place to put a little bit of information. So you see a bunch of people on a journey. Yeah, there's only 12, clearly way more than 12, even if scholars debate exactly how many went, but it gives you a little bit of a picture, that they're on the move. And then you've got all these numbers with names next to them, and the numbers with the names represent the numbers that show up on the timeline here. And not all the places that you will read about in Exodus, Numbers, and particularly Exodus and Numbers show up in this map. And we've got some place names listed here in other sorts of things, but we're going to break this down. And using the information you have on pages 129, 130, 131, 32, 33. So this one picture, unlike many of the pictures that have just one page of information about it, this actually has nearly 5 full pages of information. And so there's just a lot of stuff here as we're working our way through. Okay, so let's break it down a little bit. And if you want to watch the screen, you certainly can see how things kind of progress. So it starts with this first little jog here. As they come out of Egypt, surprise, surprise, Bible scholars debate what path did they follow. There is no uniform consensus. Most of us grew up with a Bible that translated the Hebrew as being the Red Sea. And so they crossed the Red Sea. Well, the Red Sea isn't even on this picture. You see the kind of that tip top of the Red Sea is underneath here, but the Red Sea's way south. And the Hebrew actually says the Sea of Reeds, Reeds. And so most Bible scholars would concur that they didn't get led all the way south, all the way past all this picture down below to cross this enormous body of water called the Red Sea, but rather had a water crossing in this marshy area called the Sea of Reeds, but nobody knows exactly where it was. So that's why there's a big giant question mark here. And it says the site of the crossing is uncertain. And one of the things that I appreciate about the author of these materials is his honesty. When we have something we have great certainty about, he'll talk about it with great certainty. But when there's places where there's significant debate about where it actually happened, he's honest enough to say, could be here, could be there. People debate. We're not going to get caught up in that. Okay. So that's really what your first few paragraphs on page 129 are talking about. Again, the idea or the notion or the view that it was during this period of time that the Hyksos, an outside group of people, were temporarily in control of Egypt, that would have been the time when the Israelites migrated south, when Joseph was able to rise to a position of great power. But then there came a time, as we read in the book of Exodus, that a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. And then that's the understanding that probably occurred at the time when the true Egyptians, if you want to use that kind of phrase, reclaimed their territory, pushed out the foreign people who had been ruling there, but then saw all these Hebrews as well as other people and enslaved them. That's kind of what that timeline is described there. But then we read about how under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, they went to Pharaoh to say, let my people go. They went to Pharaoh, who was not open to that. And sometimes Pharaoh hardened his heart. Sometimes God hardened his heart. But eventually, after the 10th plague with the destruction of the firstborn, Pharaoh says, go. And so the people go. And that's when they ask their neighbors for all the wealth, the clothes, the whatever jewelry they might have had. And it says they plundered the Egyptians and off they go. And then Pharaoh changes his mind yet again and heads out after them. And that's when we have the crossing at the sea. So that's the beginning of this journey. They cross the sea. God leads them with a pillar of fire by night, a pillar of cloud by day. And we read how when that pillar settled down and stayed down, the people camped in that place. And then when the pillar got up and began to move, the people broke camp and began to follow. So the pillar of fire, pillar of cloud, symbolizing the presence of God. And the first place they stopped that we're looking at here is a place called Mara. So if you want to open up in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 15, we can look at this. And because the territory covered is so immense, we're really going to take these little hop, skips, jumps through. So let's go to Exodus chapter 15, verses 22, 26. And notice, of course, this is even before they get to Mount Sinai. Okay? So I'm flipping my pages, trying to get there. Thumbs up when you've arrived. Exodus 15, 22.
Then Moses ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Mara, they could not drink the water of Mara because it was bitter. That is why it was called Mara. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" He cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he put them to the test. He said, "If you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give heed to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians. For I am the Lord who heals you."
Okay, and we'll stop there. So chances are in your Bible where it says Red Sea, if it even says Red Sea in verse 22, you've got a little footnote. And if you look down at the footnote, as mine does, it says, or Sea of Reeds. So that you're going to see. And then it's going to talk about Mara. And at the end of verse 23, there's probably a footnote next to Mara, and just tells you that Mara is a Hebrew word that means bitter or bitterness. Remember, this is the name, or actually we haven't got there yet. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the name that Naomi in the book of Ruth will tell her family and friends to call her when she gets back after she has spent time away and she's lost her husband and both of her sons. And she just brings back her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And when they see her, it's Naomi, which means my delight, right? And no, she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because my life has been bitter." Okay. So just kind of a poking ahead there, but they get here and we're already discovering what we will find over and over and over in this chapter, this in the text, not this particular Bible chapter, but as we follow this wilderness wanderings, verse 24, the people complained. In this instance, no good water, right? Moses calls out to the Lord. God shows him a piece of wood. He throws it in the water becomes sweet. And then comes this kind of statement about how the wilderness time is going to be a time of testing. It's going to show whether you are willing to trust and follow and believe despite from what you see, or are you going to grumble and complain, right? So the first stop, Mara. And then the very last little chapter or verse in this chapter talks about what? Go ahead and finish that.
There were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the well.
So number 2 in the map is Elim. And why not camp out there, right? You're probably aware back in my home state, there is a place near Palms that talks about water. That's somewhat famous, right? Palm Springs. So they came there, they camped out. Now something else happens at Elim. Somebody want to keep reading? Chapter 16, verses 1 through 3.
The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the fish pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill us, whole assembly, with hunger."
All right, so again, we haven't even got to Mount Sinai yet, but the pattern is rapidly emerging that there's going to be a lot of belly aching. In fact, the old King James helps us here with the language. Yes, exactly, right? Because they are murmuring. And if you say the word murmur 3 or 4 times, one right after another, you get the sound of what they were doing. Murmur, 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 murmur. I mean, we even sort of have, we do a little different, and we just kind of do a rah, rah, rah. But I mean, that's murmuring. And so that may be a word you remember. That's more of an older English term. And complain is kind of the newer translation, but murmur is not a bad, it's a word that sounds like what it is. Okay. And of course, it's in this part of the journey that they hear about the manna, right? Keep reading.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare which they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and you fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord."
All right. So grumble, 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 complain, complain, complain. But now comes this food that will follow them throughout their time, the manna, right? They go out and they collect it, and every day, whatever they collect, they're to use up. And not everybody does, and they just, they save a little bit of it, discover it's all wormy and gross. But amazingly, when they go out to gather before the Sabbath, they collect, they have that food, and they don't have to go collect on the Sabbath because it remains fine and edible that day. And so there's this kind of provision, and already in the wilderness time, a setting aside of Sabbath. Verse 31 of chapter 16 talks about how it was called manna, and then starts doing what we all do when we're trying to describe something to somebody that we've eaten that they haven't, right? And it's like coriander seed, it's white. It was like wafers made with, I mean, how do you describe something to somebody who hasn't had it? You have to grab a hold of things there. Watch the Food Network, yes, right. And so they be kept, and then they're actually told, and this is about the only place you hear about it. It sort of vanishes later on, but they collect if you will, this isn't exact, right? But they put it in a ball jar, that you can seal, and then you've got an example of this to show future generations. You only hear about it a couple of other times, and then later on it sort of vanishes. But they're supposed to take a jar, put some manna in it, keep it before the Lord. This is verse 33, throughout your generations. And so that's what they do. And then verse 35 tells us they ate manna for 40 years. Until they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And then they give you the Food Network comparison that an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. So you have your little chart, right? But here again, this is an example of yet another place in the scriptures where clearly This comes later. This isn't a predictive statement. They're just beginning their journey. So you can kind of tell this is being written after they've gotten past all of that, right? Because why else would you say the Israelites ate manna for 40 years? I mean, we're just starting, right? So it's just an example that some of these narrative texts are not written like there's a reporter right there writing and recording everything down as they go, but it's a reflection back upon it.
But still, they know exact measurements and weights and everything, every.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing, right? So, and then here's what's kind of interesting. The notice on page 129 in points 1 and 2 that they emphasize or they point out reference passages from Exodus, right? When you flip the page, you're suddenly at the top of page 130, you have Exodus 16. But the next thing you get is from Numbers 33. And so it's sometimes hard. And then notice, so number 0.3 is Numbers 33, 0.4 is Numbers 33, 0.5 is Numbers 13, as well as Exodus 17. So here's another challenge in trying to sort of map this out is you have multiple narratives in the Old Testament that talk about their journey through the wilderness. And they don't all give you the same information all the time. And sometimes some include information that another list doesn't. And some of these areas archaeologists can find, but others of them, they can't, or at least they haven't yet. And we sort of hope sometime they will, but so that's another thing that's a little bit confusing. But according to the list in Numbers, after they leave Elam, the next place they stop is called Dophkah. And so that's on the map. This is all part of this wilderness of sin. And sin here does not mean sin like we talk about sin in church today. It's just the name, right? And think about it, sin as the first 3 letters of Sinai. Okay. And by the way, if you got a chance to read the chapter, you probably know that the location of Mount Sinai is debated, right? So it's debated where these things are. But that's what number 3 is. They go to Dophkah, then again from Numbers, from Dophkah, they go to Elush, and then the next place is Rephidim, which we hear about in Numbers 13, but we're going to look at it in Exodus 17, since we're there. Somebody read the first 7 verses.
From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and livestock with thirst." So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?"
All right. So that again, some of that same information here. By the way, Horeb in verse 6 is another name for Sinai. So, but what do? There's not enough water, so Moses will strike this rock and water comes out.
I find it amazing that they grumbled so soon.
Yes and no. hang around church people for a while, and you will sometimes find we are very quick to grumble. Yes? I mean, and I could take the word church away. Hang around people. And you will find that we are very quick to grumble. But yeah, it is a you think to yourself, man, I can't believe it. And yet, for me, I'll speak for myself when I do some honest reflection, I can think about how many times I've grumbled and whined to God about stuff. And for me, again, I'll just speak for myself. For me, I want this to unfold in a certain way, and when God doesn't allow things to unfold in a certain way, I will take issue with that. You know, what the heck? Because I keep falling into that trap of, God, I'm doing it this way, so therefore you got to do it this way. I mean, that's the pattern there. And here's what the other thing is, really pretty powerful when we get much later to the prophets. The prophets will look back on the wilderness times as a high point in their trust and obedience to God. And we'll talk about how Israel was faithful in the times of the wilderness, which gives you an idea of how bad the times were when the prophets are speaking. So, just hang on to that, because when we come to some of those prophets and we're going to say, I need to take you back out in the wilderness because there you trusted in me. You're going, what are you talking about? All they ever did was grumble and complain, but pushing ahead, they weren't worshiping other gods, which is what they began to do as soon as they got into the promised land. And so some situations aren't as bad as others, but it's at this same place then in Exodus 17 that we read about the Amalekites fighting against them. And this is why there will be, well, look at the end of chapter 17, simply says, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. And so that becomes a hated people. And when we get to King Saul later on, you'll hear how he was ordered to go out and slaughter them all. And again, it doesn't always make sense to us, but the Amalekites are trying to stop them from getting where they're going. And of course, where they're going is Mount Sinai. And it gives you some significance. This is also the place that his father-in-law shows up and gives him some help in trying to manage the affairs of this large group of people, and in particular, Jethro, who's also known as Reuel, who's also known as Hobab, depending on where you find him in the Bible, will say to Moses, this is not a job you can do by yourself. You got to delegate. You need to find people you can rely on who can be in charge of 10 people. And you got people who can be in charge of 50, people who can be in charge of 100, people who can be in charge of 1,000. And then you have these people work, and you just deal with the hard things that none of those people can work with. So that whole pattern of trying to do that is what's involved there. Okay. And then look at our screen here, because it lights up, boom, we get to Sinai. And that's what's at the bottom of 130 and spilling over onto page 131. And we have already spent some significant time looking at what happened at Sinai with that covenant that God made with them. But again, you see this tiny little mountain down here. And even, again, I mentioned Sinai is location is debated. And here's that circle. In this case, it's only dots. But this is this circle of people around the tabernacle, because God is dwelling in the midst of his people, right? God is Emmanuel in this part of the narrative already. What is pointed out on pages 130 and 131, information that we didn't necessarily have, is a little bit about how this all kind of got designated. So you can see it was one of the Eastern Roman Empire. The term that gets used that you'd be familiar with is the Byzantine Empire with Justinian, and he was the one who designated Jebel Musa, which is this traditional Mount Sinai, built a fortress at the top. But you can see that Constantine's mother, a century and a half earlier in the 4th century, so that's in your 300s now, designated this a chapel at the base of this mountain. So this is just kind of where it goes. And apparently there's still a monastery there today. But it's at Mount Sinai that Moses goes up on the mountain and gets the 10 Commandments from God. It's at Mount Sinai that golden calf is formed, and all sorts of kind of nasty things going on, but they are at Mount Sinai. And then at the very end of point 5 on page 131, it says, in the spring of the year, 1 year after escaping from Egypt, they left Mount Sinai and headed toward the wilderness of Paran. And so now here's the wilderness of Sin, or if you like, the wilderness of Sign, because you can maybe help you remember with Sinai. And then you're going to see up here the wilderness of Paran. And so that becomes our next heading place. And they're heading out, number 6, to Taberah. Let's open up to Numbers chapter 11. So remember, they get to Sinai in Exodus 19, and then you have the rest of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and then we get to the book of Numbers, and then we pick up the story again. And it's some of the grumbling that you hear in the first part of Numbers. Let's look here. So I'm actually going to back you up to Numbers chapter 10. And in Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, they're heading out. I'll read. In the 2nd year, in the 2nd month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the covenant. Then the Israelites set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time at the command of the Lord by Moses, and then it kind of talks about how it was done, right? The standard of the camp of Judah set out first and gives you a little bit of information. And then it says, verse 17, the tabernacle was taken down and kind of how it got put together. And then you get verse 29, Moses says to Hobab, now he's talking to his father. Now he's the son of Reuel, the Midianite. We're setting out. The Lord says, we're going to go. He says, will you go with us? We'll treat you well. He says, verse 30, I don't want to go. I'm going to go back to my own land. And then Moses says, please don't leave us. You know where we should camp in the wilderness. You've lived in the wilderness. You can be our eyes. And if you go with us, whatever good God does to us, we'll do to you. And so apparently, at least for a while, he goes. So they have, we might say in sort of today's language, they've hired him in part as a guide, someone who knows the territory. And so they set out. And we were given this description at the end of Numbers 10 that whenever the ark set out, they would use these words, arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered and your foes flee before you. And then whenever it came to rest, they'd say, return, O Lord, of the 10,000 thousands of Israel. So this is sort of becomes a little worship ritual as they get ready to go, right? Well, chapter 11, guess what they do? Complain, grumble, murmur. We hear about the manna, right? And we hear about all of these things that are going wrong with where they're off. And it leads to Taberah. And Taberah is where something not so good happens, right? Let's pick up the story. We hear about the manna in the first part of the chapter 11. Then they appoint these 70 elders who are going to go, but 2 people remain in the camp. And I got to tell you the funny story. You might have heard it already, but they picked the 70 elders. They're supposed to go out. God's going to take some of the spirit of Moses to put on them to help them be leaders. But verse 26, 2 men, chapter 11, remained in the camp. One named Eldad, the other named Medad. It says the spirit rested on them. And they were among those registers, but they hadn't gone out to that tent of meeting. They prophesied in the camp. A young man ran and told Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Joshua, son of Nun, his assistant, one of his chosen men, said, my lord Moses, stop them. But Moses said, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all God's people were prophets. Would that the Lord would put his spirit on all of them. Well, why do I point that out? Because in my first parish, a very delightful reading occurred, because this text actually shows up regularly in every 3 years in the lectionary readings. And here's how the person read it. Verse 28. Joshua, son of Nun, the assistant of Moses, one of his chosen men, said, my Lord, Moses, stop them. Which, of course, he didn't really say, my Lord, Moses. He said, my Lord, Moses. But the person read it, my Lord, Moses. That just tickles me. I think that's kind of funny. Well, what happens next? Somebody pick up verse 31 and following.
Now, we went out from the sea. It scattered them up to about 2 cubits deep all around the camp, as far as the days long, in any direction. All that day and night, and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail. No one gathered less than, bless you, 10 homers. Then they spread them out all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. Therefore the place was named Kibroth-Hattaavah, because they were buried. There they buried the people who had craved other food. From Kibroth-Hattaavah, all the people traveled to Hazeroth and stayed there.
All right, so following our journey, we're at Taberah, then we go to Kibroth-Hattaavah, and then we get to Hazeroth. They're all kind of right in there, but so they're not only going to have the manna, but they're going to have the quail. But you have this rather strange narrative of how as they were eating, this plague pours out, right? And I don't have any good way to explain it except to say that complaining and grumbling and murmuring is like a cancer for a group. And it's going to kill the group to some degree. And that's literally what happens here. But if you've ever been part of a group that has had really good things happen, and then suddenly it just goes south and bad and sort of seems to come unraveled, it's almost always at its root, you'll find a group of people who starts grumbling and complaining about what's going on. And that kills the spirit. Doesn't mean we can't be disappointed. It doesn't mean we can't disagree. It doesn't mean we can't have debates about things. But very often, when grumbling and complaining become the heart of what happens, it becomes a very unpleasant place. And there hopefully won't be this kind of literal death that we read about here. But this is how healthy churches die, or go on to a path of dying. Or this is how a healthy club will die, because if pretty soon all the people are grumbling and complaining. Or a healthy Bible study, or a healthy group, or a healthy collection of friends. I mean, it doesn't really matter the setting or situation, or a team for that matter. When there's that kind of stuff going on, it's there. But so that's path 8. And Hazeroth, we hear a little bit about here and there. But it's at Hazeroth that point 8, and this is on page 131 in your text. This is where Aaron and Miriam have a complaint against Moses. So not only that he's married to a foreign woman, and you'll see that theme get repeated numerous times throughout the biblical narrative as we journey along, but also complaining about the fact that he's, why do you think you're the leader and we should be? And that's where you get that horrid story of Miriam being struck with leprosy, right? And people will rightly say, well, what's up? Her brother was grumbling too. Why does she the one who gets hammered? Well, it I don't know.
Yeah, see, I thought I read that.
Well, her name's listed first, so maybe she's the oldest in the family, maybe, but yeah, it's hard to tell, but I mean, I'm careful to make it too clean, right? Because even if she was the instigator, her brother went along, and how come he didn't suffer some of the consequences, right? But what is interesting is they don't move from this place. If you look at the end of chapter 12, they don't move from this place until she's healed.
That was supposed to be 7 days.
Yeah. But they hang out there for 7 days, it says. So Miriam, she's shut outside the camp. So she becomes, in many ways, even though we've gotten through Leviticus, which talked, as you may, if you read through it, has a chapter on leprosy. Here's kind of the first example of that. And so perhaps one could argue that here one of their leaders is clearly living out the statutes and ordinances pertaining to leprosy. But it is interesting. They don't leave her behind, but they wait until her time of cleansing is done. All right. And then what's interesting is back in Numbers 10 and in Numbers 35, they'll stop. But notice what happens in this. Watch the thing from number 8 on the screen. The next stop, all the way up to the top. And here's where the spies, chapter 13, are sent to Canaan. So let's read that. Somebody read verses 1 through 16 of chapter 13.
The Lord said to Moses, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each of their ancestral tribes you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. So Moses sent them from the wilderness to Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them leading men along the Israelites. These were their names.
And I'll stop you. We don't have to go through all their names. Unless you really want to, you're okay. But notice one of the last ones. Notice the person in verse 8. You have, an Ephraimite is Hoshea, but then you go to the end of verse 16. Read verse 16.
These are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses changed the name of Hoshea, son of Nun, to Joshua.
Okay, so lots of times multiple names. It's just sort of how it is. You got to kind of get used to it. But each tribe has a representative.
I just wanted to say, one says to spy, and the other version says to explore. And how do you, well, I can see the connection, but.
So what my translation says, spy out. To spy out is to reconnaissance, right? So it involves exploring, but it's also who's there, what's going on, but it's not what would you call public exploration. It's more what would be the good word for it? Sneaky. Yeah, it's, you know, you're going to check out a land that you're planning to conquer and take possession of. So you don't do this announced. And so that's why some of the translations will use the word spy out or to explore, or but it's covert. These are covert exploring, not overt exploring. Keep going. 17 through 21. 20. Okay, turn your page.
Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up there into the Negev and go up into the hill country and see what the land is like. Whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land they live in is good or bad, whether the towns that they live in are unwalled or fortified, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be bold and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now it was the season of the first ripe grapes.
Right. So again, some of that idea that they're doing reconnaissance, right? Keep going.
So they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin and Rohab, near the Lebo Hamath, and went up into the Negev and came to Hebron and Ahim, Sheshai and Talmai, and Anakites. The Anakites were there. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. And they came to the Wadi Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes. And they carried it on a pole before 2 of them. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Wadi Eshcol because of the cluster that the Israelites cut down from there.
So imagine one cluster of grapes, so of such a size that they put it on a pole that 2 guys had to carry, right? And again, you probably have a little footnote that Eshcol means cluster, right? So you get some of those things. Well, they go, they do what they're supposed to do, they bring back some fruit of the land, and now they give their report. Finish off.
At the end of the 40 days, they returned from spying out the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against this people, for they are stronger than we. So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim and the Anakites come from the Nephilim, and to others we seemed the grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them.
Right. So they bring back, good news, bad news, right? Good news is it is a land full of milk and honey. It's incredible. Look at this giant cluster of grapes. Bad news is the people, the towns are well fortified. The peoples are like giants. We seem like grasshoppers. There's no way we can do this. Although Caleb said, no, we can. But this is this thing. And notice it's verse 25 says at the end of 40 days, that's going to play a role. Somebody else pick up chapter 14, verses 1 through 4.
That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt. Or in this wilderness, sorry. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land, only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should easily go back to Egypt.
So, how come we didn't die in Egypt? How come we didn't die in the wilderness? Now our wives and kids are going to be captured. We better go back. Ah, the faith of the people. Keep going.
Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explained the land, tore their clothes, and so the entire Israelite assembly. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. But the whole assembly talked about stoning them.
All right, so it's 2 against 10. And if you will, you've got a majority report and a minority report. And the people are going to follow the majority report, and what happens? Go ahead, finish through chapter or verse 12.
And the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they.
So this initial response from God is, let's wipe them all out and start again. Sound familiar? Sounds like what we heard with the flood, but it's not where the story ends. Keep going.
Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power, you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. They have already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, and that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, and that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, the nations who have heard this report about you will say, the Lord was not able to bring these people into the land he promised them on oath, so he slaughtered them in the wilderness. Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time that they left Egypt until now. Then the Lord replied, I have forgiven them, as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory in the signs I performed in Egypt in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valley, turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron.
I'll stop you there. So what's going to happen? Well, interestingly enough, with this I'll use the word threat. With the threat, God says, I'm just going to wipe them out. Moses does what? He intercedes. Right? He says, no, don't do it. And he makes some interesting arguments, right? One of which being, if you do it that way, you realize, of course, everybody's going to say, well, that's just because God couldn't pull it off. Sort of appeals to like this sense of pride or something like that. But also, interestingly enough, appeals to this passage, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgressions, by no means clearing the guilty. You probably have that set different typeset wise. It's probably more poetic than narrative, perhaps in your Bibles, but he basically says in verse 19, forgive them. And God says, I do. But there are consequences. What are the consequences? Any adult, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, will not enter the promised land because they were there. So we talk about them wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They're just in there a couple of years and ready to go in. But they aren't ready to go in. And so now they'll have 38 more years. So a total of 40, which is interesting. The spies are gone for 40 days. The consequences, they will end up spending 40 years in the wilderness. And so that those who left Egypt as adults will perish in the wilderness, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. And so that becomes the consequences of what they had done here. And what happens very next then, in what I stop you reading, then when they hear this news, they say, well, okay, well, no, I don't want that deal. Let's go ahead and conquer the land. And so they gather a little group of people to go up and fight, and they get their butts kicked. And so it's like you've got this, the door was open, they refused to go through, so the door gets closed and it won't open again for 38 years. And the only adults who will go into the promised land are Caleb and Joshua. And so the adults who, so there's consequences.
Doesn't it seem like you should have been able to ask for forgiveness and gotten another chance?
Well, do you always get another chance, right? I mean, so then there's the difference between, and this is where the New Testament will pick up on temporal consequences versus eternal consequences. So there still will be and we'll see this over and over. David will be the first big example that we get when he uses his power to coerce Bathsheba to be intimate with him. That you'll catch that story when we get there. And you're going to see how everything starts breaking apart. David's life is going swimmingly up until that point. But as soon as he does this, it all starts to unravel. And yet there's forgiveness, but there's also consequences. So it's this, in the practical sense, you can, and I mean, this happens in marriages, this happens in families, this happens in classrooms, this happens in groups, right? That when there's rebellion, there's going to be, the unity and the fabric is broken down, and that can be restored, but you never move into that new without carrying the wounds and the scars of the old. And so at least that's how I see this unfolding. But this is another place where you asked earlier about, man, they're just complaining so fast. This is another place where I see so many parallels in our own lives, or even for me, and you've heard me say this perhaps in sermons and other places, that when I was younger, I used to say, God, why couldn't I have lived in the time of the disciples? It'd be so much easier to be a follower and a believer. And then you see how the disciples who are watching this all unfold before their eyes can't pull it off. So it's just, it speaks to the persistent stubbornness of our human nature. And it speaks to the persistent reality that the human people in the story are not the heroes. It's God leading them through the wilderness. God doesn't destroy them, but the consequence is that you won't live to see the promise fulfilled, but your children will. And so, this is, if you look at the end of chapter 14, verse 39, for example, it says, let's see here. Is that where I want to grab it? Well, no, somebody just read that. Somebody start in verse 26 and read through the end of the chapter. Read the second part here.
And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, how long shall this wicked congregation complain against me? I have heard the complaints of the Israelites, which they complain against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. Your dead bodies shall fall in this very wilderness, and of all your number included in the census from 20 years old and upward, who have complained against me, not one of you shall come into the land in which I swore to settle you, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. But your little ones, who consider they become booty, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have despised. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day a year, you shall bear your iniquity, 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely I will do thus to all this wicked congregation gathered together against me. In this wilderness we shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. And the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation complain against him by bringing a bad report about the land, the men who brought an unfavorable report about the land died by a plague before the Lord. But Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, alone remained alive of those men who went to spy out the land. When Moses told these words to all the Israelites, the people mourned greatly. They rose early in the morning and went up to the heights of the high country, saying, here we are. We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. But Moses said, why do you continue to transgress the command of the Lord? That will not succeed. Do not go up, for the Lord is not with you. Do not let yourselves be struck down before your enemies. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites will confront you there, and you shall fall by the sword. Because you have turned back from following the Lord will not be with you. But they presumed to go up to the heights of the hill country, even though the ark of the covenant of the Lord and Moses had not left the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and defeated them, pursuing them as far as Hormuz.
Okay. So, you get, in a sense, the judgment here is you're going to get the very thing you complained that you thought was going to happen. It's just generally not a good idea to grumble and complain, right? Doesn't mean we can't voice things, and we'll see this when we get to the New Testament, for example, and we get the difference between Zechariah and Mary. And when the angel comes to Zechariah and says, God has heard your prayer, you and your elderly wife Elizabeth are going to have a child. And Zechariah goes, yeah, sure, right. And he can't talk until John is born and named, right? Mary says to God, boy, that's pretty amazing. Not quite sure how that's going to happen. And gets a different explanation. So you get some of these things are parallel. But anyway, so this is what happens to them at Kadesh Barnea, and that's what's all over on the bottom of page 131 and spilling out to the top of page 132. And there's more to it. We skipped the offerings in Numbers chapter 15. And Bibles that do that. So now you get a revolt, and we won't read in Numbers chapter 16, but you'll have the revolt of Korah. And this is where the earth all of a sudden swallows them up, right? So you're getting this breakdown in unity. That's happening in chapter 16. It's finally, and then there's, well, why is Aaron? I mean, there's other Levites here. Come on, there's other tribal leaders here. And then Aaron's rod will sprout almonds. And so that is all taking place kind of in this realm here. And they will be camped out at this area of Kadesh Barnea for much of their time. But there's a few other places. Now look at page 132 in your text. They're going to head down, and so they're kind of just hanging out in this area, right? And remember, they've got their livestock, so they're not going to stay in one place because their animals will eat up whatever grass is there, and they'll move on to other places. And they finally get ready at the end of that time, number 10, which is Punan, and they want to go into follow this King's Highway. And you see this highway that starts down here at Ezion Geber, and then it's just kind of this line that goes stretching all the way up to Damascus. So this is like this ancient trade route that people will follow, and it gets referred to as the King's Highway. But they're not getting permitted by the Edomites to go through there. And remember, the Edomites come from Esau. So the Israelites come from Jacob. Jacob's name changed to Israel. And so the Israelites and the Edomites are cousins. When we get to the Moabites and the Ammonites, those are the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Remember, after Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed and they're in the cave and the daughters are afraid they're never going to have any children. So they get dad drunk and they sleep with him, and they each have a child, and one's named Ammon and one's named Moab. They get these. So you get these kind of unfavorable descriptions way back in Genesis about what these people are going to be, and they're going to treat them sometimes a little bit differently. But you see the Edomite here, it mentions Edom. So they're going to go and they say, no, you can't go through. And so then, oops, I'm going the wrong direction. Then they're going to go around. And we got several of these places, but they're going to go around the land of Edom and Moab. And when they get here in this last section, that's where they bump into Og, the king of Bashan, and who's the other guy? I'm blanking on his name. The giant. Oh, for goodness sakes, Jeffrey. Sihon, there it is. Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. Og is the one I remembered. It's Sihon. I forgot. But let's scoot a little bit further, because we get in I'm doing it again. Numbers chapter 20, something not so good happens. Somebody read Numbers chapter 20, verse 1.
The Israelites, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there.
So, passing of one generation. Keep going.
Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and against Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we had died when our kindred died before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is no place for it is to bring wait a minute. It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and command the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Thus you shall bring water out of the rock for them. Thus you shall provide drink for the congregation and their livestock." So Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and by which he showed his holiness." Keep going.
No, we'll stop there. So what happens? Now Moses and Aaron. Yeah, And this-
Had they already been told that they weren't gonna make it into the
no,
promised land?
this is the first time. This is the first time. And sometimes hard to understand. This is the second time that they brought water from a rock, but it's done, it's done in this point in anger, and Moses loses his cool. And this is the same Moses who, when God threatens to destroy the people, pleads and begs the Lord to have mercy on them. Remember, that happened up at Mount Sinai with the golden calf. That happened again in that passage we just read a few minutes ago. But here Moses says, fine, you want to get water out of a rock? Here you go. And instead of speaking that the Lord will bring water for you, he says, I'm bringing you water. I mean, to many people, this looks minor, but this is, and the word Meribah means quarrel. This is where Moses now learns, and Aaron for that matter, that they will not enter the promised land. In fact, you've got headings. You can see before we finish this chapter, Aaron dies. So now not even Moses is going to get into the land. An interesting fact, and I was trying to remember if it was mentioned in here, because I listened to some the author of these materials has put in some teaching tips on CDs, so I've been listening to those too to try and help ready myself for this. But in this part of the wilderness, they have the word that they use is a wadi, W-A-D-I. We would use the word canyon, or down in Arizona, they'd use the word gulch. Back in home in California, it would be called a wash. But what wadis are is they are, arroyo is another word for it. They are dry, mostly dry riverbeds. There might be a small trickle of a stream, but there isn't a constant river flowing. However, when it does rain, and believe it or not, it does rain in the wilderness, because of the content of the soil, it can't absorb the rain. And so all the rainwater washes off. And this is in essence a flash flood. So we have those, we've had them here in our community. You've had them probably in other places where you live, where there's lots of concrete or asphalt or hard surfaces it can't absorb. And so what happens in these wadis is when it starts to rain hard, you need to get up and out of them, because sometimes it's only minutes before a flash flood will come racing through. But as that water goes racing through those canyons, those wadis, those gulches, those arroyos, those gullies, whatever you end up calling them, some of the water washes up and gets caught behind rocks. And so still today, Bedouin sheep herders, or with their sheep or goats, as they go through, will look for some of these places and they'll tap the rock and water will come up. And so that's that. So think of it as God leading Moses to those places where there would essentially be a well of water that had been up behind this rock. And if you know something, if I understand something about water in wells, when water's in stone, stone serves as a filter for that. And so it's actually very good water to drink, where they might have sometimes not so good water or no water at all in other places. But this is kind of what's happening here, if you will, the scientific explanation perhaps behind the water from the rock. It's not as if suddenly miraculously, although it could have been, that water just emerges where there wasn't any water before, but rather they went to one of those places where water had been stored after some of these events had occurred. So that's kind of interesting too. But so just looking at headings, right? So after this, they refuse to go through Edom, so they have to go around. Aaron will die in the next section, and he gets buried someplace on Mount Hor. But prior to his death, his son Eleazar is raised up as a faithful, the next successor of that. And then chapter 21. Let's spend a little time there. Somebody want to read the first 9 verses of 21?
When the Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming by the way of the mountain, he fought against Israel and took some of them captive. Then Israel made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed give this people into our hands, then we will utterly destroy their towns. The Lord listened to the voice of Israel and handed over the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their towns, so the place was called Hormah.
The Hormah means destruction. Keep going.
For about 4, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, but the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food.
And what's the miserable food? The manna and the quail, right? We're sick of this. Change the stupid menu. Keep going.
And the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, we have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live. So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole. And whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at it, at the serpent of bronze, and live.
If you look at your footnotes, the word fiery or poisonous are all related to the word seraph or seraphim, right? So you remember hearing about the cherubim and the seraphim, the fiery heavenly beings, whatever exactly they are. But here again, they're complaining and grumbling, similar to what we've run across before, yields a different kind of poisonous result. Literally, poisonous serpents who bite them, and when they're bit, they die. And interestingly enough, in this passage, when they cry to the Lord for mercy, God doesn't take the poisonous serpents away. God has Moses cast the serpent of bronze, put on a pole, so when you're bit by that serpent and you see the bronze serpent on the pole, you'll live. Sound familiar? Go to John chapter 3. In the Gospel of John, chapter 3, Jesus is having a conversation with the Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus. You'd be very familiar, of course, with verse 16 of chapter 3. But in the midst of this conversation, Jesus says to Nicodemus, I'll start in verse 11, very truly I tell you, we speak of what we know and testify to what we've seen, yet you do not receive our testimony. If I've told you about earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you about heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. So when we, if you will, are bit by the poisonous serpent of sin, who puts its venom in us to kill us because sin kills, we look to the one raised up on the cross and receive forgiveness. And so this passage in Numbers is brought forward later. You'll also, when we get a little further on and bump into a king by the name of Josiah, you're going to hear, surprise, surprise, that the Israelites have kept this serpent as a part of their religious practices, but have gotten off course with it and are starting to offer sacrifices to it as if it were a god by itself. And so it gets kind of ugly. But what happens in the subsequent chapters is, as the people, they skirt Moab, but then Sihon, one of the kings, they again ask permission to go up the king's highway. He says no, and he actually brings out his troops to fight. And so they defeat him. And then King Og does the same thing. They defeat him. And this is where then a king Balak summons a seer named Balaam to come and curse the people. And that's what the whole section on pages 134 and 135 is about Balaam, son of Beor. And we'll have time to read a little bit of this. But so as these, remember with these people groups, you have different kings. It's sometimes helpful. It's not the exact sort of word, but you might think of a chieftain, or more negative, a warlord, right? What's a warlord? A warlord is a leader of a group of people, and they all look to him as the leader. And so the kings are sort of like that, as we hear. So unlike a king over a giant territory, these would be kings over smaller areas. And so as Sihon king dies and Og king dies, Balak, who's a king, sees this happening, and he's thinking, I've got to do something different. And so he goes and calls somebody named Balaam. This is 22 verse 5. He sends messengers to him, and supposedly he lives kind of up way, it's off the map kind of at this point, up over here, near on the Euphrates River. And they summon him, and he says this message. He says, the people have come out of Egypt. They're spread over the face of the earth. They've settled next to me. Come, curse them. They're more powerful than I, but I can defeat them if you curse them, because I know if you bless people, they're blessed. If you curse people, they're cursed. And so he wants to bring in some divine help, because he's hiring a professional curser, right? And so they approach him and tell him that this is what he wants. And so what happens is he goes off by himself. This is verse 8. He says, stay here. I'll bring back word to you. And so God comes to him and says, what are these men doing? And Balaam says, well, King Balak, he's a Moabite king. He sent me telling me these people have come out of Egypt. God says, verse 12, don't go with them. Don't curse them. They're blessed. So the next morning, Balaam says, sorry, can't help you. See where that is? Verse 13. And so they go back. Well, they bring the report back to the king. He says, well, let's up the ante. Apparently what we sent was not worth his while. So they go again. And his reply, verse 18, is, if you were to give me your house full of gold, your house full of silver, I couldn't do more than the Lord my God, and notice it's Lord, all capitals, the Lord my God, to do less or more. But he says, what the heck? And you begin to think at this point, perhaps he's thinking, dang, did I really hear God right? I mean, that's a pretty good payout of what they're asking me to do. So he goes back, and this time God says, just go with them, but you only do what I tell you to do. But notice, first time God said, don't go. Wasn't good enough answer for Balaam. So he goes back to God. He says, you sure, God? You sure? And now God says, okay, go. But you're going to see how God's second go is not really a go. It's similar to what you saw where God said to the people, okay, you're grumbling that you're going to die in the wilderness? Then I'll let you have what you want. Because the very next verse, God's anger is kindled because Balaam's going, right? People say, well, what's God mad for? Didn't he just tell him to go? Well, not really. He says, if you want to go, you're on your own. And what happens, of course, with this, the donkey sees the angel with the sword drawn, so he turns off and goes into the field. Balaam strikes the donkey. Then they head up have to change directions a little bit. They go up the path. He sees the angel. He moves over in the path, scrapes Balaam's foot. He gets mad. He hits the donkey. And then finally, on the third time, the angel's right in the middle of a very narrow way. There's no place he can go. So the donkey simply sits down. Balaam hits the donkey again. And that's when it says the Lord opens his mouth to say. And so we have this conversation. And so you can say, sort of jokingly, tongue in cheek, that what's happening now is a conversation between two jackasses. One real donkey who knows what's going on, and another jackass who's stupid and doesn't have a clue, right? You can have a little fun, fun with that. But finally, Balaam, God lets him see this death that his donkey has saved him from. And he even says, right, I've sinned, for I know, if it's displeasing, I'll go home, right? Well, by this point, that's in verse 34. God says, go ahead and go. We're going to finish this out now. And what ends up happening is on multiple occasions, Balak, the king, has these sacrifices and wants Balaam to curse, and he keeps blessing. He keeps blessing. He keeps blessing. 3 times the blessing occurs. And we will later hear about Balaam being killed in the narrative. But look at a couple of things. Chapter 23, verse 8, he says, how can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom God has not denounced? And there's even a kind of a prophecy that a star shall come out of Jacob and a scepter out of Israel. That shows up in chapter 24. In the 4th oracle, he says, I see him, but not now. Behold him, he's not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the borderlands of Moab and the territory of all the Shethites, and etc. Sort of this prediction that out of this people group is going to come a power that controls that land. And so eventually they get all the way to be perching at the edge of the promised land when we get to the end of the book of Numbers. But we have to take a little bit of a stop to perhaps the most saddest chapter in this sometimes sad narrative. Go to chapter 25. Somebody can read 1 through 5 to start with. And it's Shittim, if you want to know how to pronounce it, or just say S.
While Israel was staying at Shittim, the people began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Thus Israel yoked itself to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and impale them in the sun before the Lord, in order that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you shall kill any of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor.
Okay, uh-oh. Now we thought there was some nasty, challenging, difficult stuff in the narrative, and of course there has been. Now we run into, for the first time, idolatry, fertility gods and goddesses, worshipped by the local Moabites, and they're already starting to draw the Israelites in. And this is one of those narratives that if you know where we're going to end up, it's sort of like it's the turning on of the spigot, because what begins here at this place will plague the Israelites for the next several hundred years. And we're going to take a look at a picture here that tries to break it down a little bit. You get on pages 136 and 137 kind of some information, but here's what is immensely different in, I'll just call the word promised land versus Egypt. In Egypt, you have the Nile. There's a constant flow of water, and the way agriculture is conducted in Egypt, I understand still to this day, is that you're drawing water out of the Nile, and so you can have little canals and make different ways to water your crops. It's constant, that's the water source. And it's only when rare instances that there's drought in Egypt that they come into great difficulty. But by and large, outside of the Jordan River Valley, there is not constant water available in the land. They're dependent upon rain. And so while this isn't specifically told to us in the scripture, the sense is when the Israelites move into Egypt, they got to find a new way to farm. And here's how the ancients understood this. There would be both male and female gods, right? Gods and goddesses. And these little, so you see the figures in the center, but on either side, these are based upon things they've dug up archaeologically. And what's sort of both fascinating and distressing about these little handheld gods and goddesses is they're obviously sexual. Here you see on the right-hand side, a goddess with two hands under her breasts. In some of these things, there'll be dozens of breasts all over the person. And then a little harder to see with the male, but his shape is phallic in shape. And sometimes there's a very long thing dangling between his legs that's very clear. I mean, it's just clearly highly sexual. And here's their understanding that the way nature happens is that the earth or the sky god, who's masculine, inseminates the earth goddess, who's feminine, and the rain coming down is his insemination of her, which yields crops. And so the idea is that as the gods sexually interact, that's what brings the rain, that's what brings the growth, that's what brings the crops. And so you've got a check mark here next to some crops growing and a cross out next to the covenant, not to suggest that these ancient neighbors of Israel didn't have any moral or ethical codes, but the moral and ethical codes were not what their religion was about. Their religion was about fertility, and that's why they're always called fertility religions. And so here in Numbers chapter 25, you read about, it starts off with men having sexual relationships with women. That's the sort of act that's happening. But it says, verse 2, that they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and they bowed down to their gods. Because here's then the thinking. The thinking is that when you don't have rain happening, that means the gods aren't being sexually intimate with each other. And so what you do as a part of your religious practice is you, as people, go to the local temple or worship place, hook up with a temple prostitute, have sexual relationship with them. The gods watch this and say, wow, that's interesting. Why don't we do that? It sounds silly, but the thought behind it is that we can influence the gods, which, by the way, is not, so can we influence, can we manipulate God? Well, isn't that what happens when we try to flip this over and say, hey, God, because because we, therefore you, it's really the same sort of thing. We're called to yield to God, to submit to God. But what happens is the Israelites get attracted to this particular way of pursuing worship. Like I sort of jokingly say, probably much easier for Canaanites to invite their friends to worship. Hey, you should see the temple prostitute they brought here. I mean, and apparently it doesn't mention that so much in the text, but you will hear later on about male and female prostitutes appearing in Israelite worship practice. And what isn't always clear is, are the male prostitutes there for the women so that they can go? Or is this the male prostitutes for the men? We don't really know for sure. It's unclear. But what happens is this whole Baal worship emerges. And as the people get close to getting into the promised land, they're already entangled in it. And as they will enter into the land, they will continue to be entangled with it. So much so that some scholars estimate that 90% of the people, that's on page 138 in one of the summary points, that 90% of the Israelites worship the Baals 90% of the time. And so when we get to the prophets, which is much later, you're going to hear the prophets warning, and it's often very sexually laced language, that the people are going a-whoring after other gods, because this is one of the ways that they would practice. So look what happens in Numbers 25. So we're told in verse 1, that's where the men start having sexual relations with the women. We're told in verse 2, they're invited to the sacrifices of their gods. They ate and bowed down to their gods. So it would be parties and food, as well as, feasting, as well as orgies, or whatever you want to call them. And then we're told, verse 3, that Israel yoked itself to the Baal of Peor, and that God's anger was kindled. And what is told Moses to do? Take all the chiefs, right? The leaders are going to pay the consequences. They're going to be impaled, right? They're going to be crucified. They're going to be stuck on stakes in the sun. So the leaders of those people are going to have to pay the price to somehow do this. And so Moses says, each of you shall kill any of your people. Well, look what happens next. Verse 6, just then, one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman into his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the Israelites. Well, they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting, right? I mean, they've come to recognize that they've blown it. And what happens? Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, so one of Aaron's grandsons, he sees it. He's one of the priests. He gets up, he leaves the congregation, he takes a spear, he goes in after the Israelite man and into the tent and pierces the two of them through the belly with one thrust. So it tells you what they were doing, that with one spear thrust, he could kill both of them. And so the plague is stopped, and yet 24,000 died. And so you're going to get this kind of bad news happening. And this is where we get led. But this is the fertility religions. Then this is what they were doing. And you read a little bit about a Babylonian account with Tiamat and Marduk and some of these kinds of things, some of the things they believed about how the world was created. And sort of interesting. This could have easily have been put at the very beginning when we looked at Genesis, because here it talks about how human beings were, in this narrative, human beings were created to do the work because the gods didn't want to work. But how they were making so much noise, and they were so noisy that they were going to be killed. And it's just very, very strange. And how this one god was killed and chopped in half. And so they used that God's body to make the sun, the sky, the moon. So again, this whole different emphasis of how God spoke the world into existence rather than using a pre-existing matter. But you also have another group and another story from Ugarit, the Ugaritic ideas of the Baal and the Ashtartes. So there were sort of a supreme male god, a supreme female god, and then sort of all sorts of lesser gods. And it mentions how they show up with different names in different parts of that ancient world. But it gives you an idea of what the Canaanite fertility religions are about. And don't get trapped into the sense of this is silly. They thought if we do this, the gods are going to do this, but do be captured by the sense that there's this notion that we can influence the gods. We can manipulate the gods. We can get God to do what we want, right? God, I promise, if you will do this, then I'll do. I mean, those sorts of bargains are there, which is why the last picture, then I just put a big X over the top. This is not what God wants, but we're going to see how the infection starts in Numbers 25 and continues to be a part of their lives for the next several hundred years. And it won't be until they are finally ejected from the land and carried off into exile in Babylon and return from Babylon that we find they've finally had this sort of leached out of their system. But we got a ways to go before we get there.
And they were carried off, Babylon and so on, was that 400 years?
About 70 years in Babylon. Yeah, there were about 70 years in Babylon. So we've gone a chunk of time here, and I would take you in your question book to page 35. And we won't spend a great deal of time, but the first question says, some of the Israelites who conquered and settled in Canaan might have been tempted to conclude that God gave them the land because they were worthy and deserved it. Well, our journey through it says, how valid would such a claim have been in light of the events which took place during the wilderness wanderings? Well, clearly, they're not. I mean, they start grumbling right away. But the more interesting question is, how should Christians react today when people suggest that God has given them a certain land or that in some way they deserve it? We better be focused on God's grace, right? And not trying to have a deserving. Here's fascinating. Jeremiah, you can look these up if you didn't already. In chapter 2, Hosea in chapter 2, state that during the period of the wilderness wanderings, Israel's relationship with God was good.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And we'll see it. So we'll sort of hang on to that. But as awful as this grumbling and complaining and whining and crying and all this stuff in the wilderness is as they start to come out of the wilderness, chapter 25 of Numbers, that's where the idolatry sets in. And of course, you know the first commandment, no other gods. But we will watch these grumbling, complaining people who God brings in by grace quickly turn and worship the Baals. The whole book of Judges will talk about that. So we've got to get Deuteronomy and Joshua, but we're going to get there. So it's really interesting that way. So anyway, we've got to let's go to our prayers, and we will come. Where are we at here? Let's pray. And again, these prayers for me, it's like taking a shower, cleaning all the guck off, right? Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. So our next lesson is going to be on Deuteronomy. So you kind of have to bring this book still with you, because we'll do the summary points. But we're going to move to Deuteronomy. And again, Deuteronomy is set at the end of this picture where they are at the promised land and waiting to go in. Moses is not going to go with them. And so the setting for Deuteronomy is essentially Moses's farewell speech, where he'll summarize what they have experienced, where he'll summarize what God has done, where he summarize how they should live their lives. But also, interestingly enough, you'll hear some other pieces that will go into more detail as we get there. But thank you for pushing through some of these challenging things. So
Before after he sees the promised land, does he die?
yes, he does. So he will get to see the promised land, but he won't get to go into it. So.